On the day when two of his cabinet members became deeply implicated in the presidential impeachment investigation by the House of Representatives, Donald Trump tweeted that one of the chairmen conducting the impeachment investigation, Congressman Adam Schiff, should be arrested for treason. But the president did that in his typically cowardly way of putting a question mark at the end of the Trump thought. Arrest for treason, question mark. The one thing in this life that we are now guaranteed is that for as long as Twitter exists and Donald Trump exists, Donald Trump will be tweeting a treason accusation at someone. And it is time for America to take a deep breath about treason. Okay? Get ready. No one has committed treason. Donald Trump has not committed treason. And no one Donald Trump has accused of committing treason has committed treason because they cannot commit treason. The law defines treason as making war on the United States or giving aid and comfort to the enemies of the United States. And enemies is a legal word. The courts have interpreted the word enemies to legally mean only the countries that are declared enemies in a congressional declaration of war. And since the United States has not had a congressional declaration of war since World War II, we also have not had a successful treason prosecution since World War II. So it is, in effect, legally impossible to commit treason these days involving Russia or any other country. But there are other laws you can violate, as President Trump appears to in his phone call with the president of Ukraine, where he's asking for help in his re-election campaign. It is a crime to solicit campaign help from a foreign country. In a tweet today, President Trump, who does not understand the law, said, again, the president of Ukraine said there was zero pressure put on him by me, case closed, exclamation point, as I am sure I will have to repeat for the rest of the year. The law does not use the word pressure. The law uses the word solicit. It is a crime just to ask for the help, even if you ask very politely. Much of the news media has fallen into the trap of using the concept of pressure as being legally relevant, but it is not. So as you follow the coverage of the impeachment of Donald J. Trump for the rest of this year, just remember, no one involved is ever going to be charged with treason by Congress or prosecutors. So you can get the word treason out of your head, and you can get the word pressure out of your head, because it's irrelevant to the presidential phone call in which Donald Trump solicited help from Ukraine for his re-election campaign. And pressure is irrelevant to the new case revealed today of Donald Trump soliciting help from Australia in his re-election campaign. But the most important news of the night remains centered on what we can now be sure will be Article 1 in the articles of impeachment against President Trump, the phone call with the president of Ukraine. Donald Trump is never going to stop telling the lie that the whistleblower's report of that phone call is not accurate, even though it has proved accurate in every detail so far. And new information gathered about the case since the whistleblower's report has been released has only been more damning to Donald Trump and his cabinet than the whistleblower's report is. The one huge new fact we learned today that is not specifically referenced in the whistleblower's report is that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was listening in on the phone call that Donald Trump had with the president of Ukraine. The whistleblower did not know that. The whistleblower's report says that approximately a dozen White House officials listened to the call. The whistleblower listed one State Department official by name who also listened in on the call, Ulrich Brechtbuhl. And now we know Mike Pompeo was listening in on the call, which means that the reality of the call is even worse than what the whistleblower described with the evidence that the whistleblower was able to collect. The Wall Street Journal broke the news today that Mike Pompeo is now a direct witness to the most important evidence in the impeachment investigation. The Journal reported Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was among administration officials who listened in on the July 25th phone call between President Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. A senior State Department official said Monday. NBC News has also confirmed that Mike Pompeo was listening to that phone call, according to a senior State Department official. So, whistles are being blown everywhere now. A senior State Department official exposed the Secretary of State today as a direct witness to the presidential phone call, which means a senior State Department official has exposed the full dimensions of the deceit in Mike Pompeo's answer about the whistleblower complaint and the phone call last week, after the official record of the phone call had been made public and after the whistleblower's complaint had been made public. Here is what Mike Pompeo said last Thursday.
The whistleblower complaint does not appear to suggest any allegation of impropriety from people in the State Department. Is that correct? Are you confident that none of your staff, that you or none of your staff did anything improper in this whole situation? Thank you.
So, Matt, I haven't had a chance to actually read the whistleblower complaint yet. I read the first couple of paragraphs and then got busy today. But I'll ultimately get a chance to see it. If I understand it right, it's from someone who had secondhand knowledge.
He got busy today. Secondhand knowledge. Mike Pompeo standing there had first-hand knowledge. Mike Pompeo heard that presidential phone call. And if he had any intention of ever revealing that he was on that phone call, Mike Pompeo could have said right then and there, I have firsthand knowledge of the phone call. I listened to that phone call. And Donald Trump did not say or do anything wrong in that phone call. But Mike Pompeo did not defend the phone call that he listened to. Was Mike Pompeo still hoping, as of Thursday of last week, that he could get away with pretending he wasn't on the phone call? When Mike Pompeo was hit the next day, on Friday, with subpoenas from the House committees for all of the State Department documents about that phone call, did Mike Pompeo still think that he was going to be able to get away with pretending he was not on that phone call? Was Mike Pompeo planning to defy those subpoenas? Did the State Department official who blew the whistle on Mike Pompeo today know that Mike Pompeo was planning to defy those subpoenas? Mike Pompeo was part of what Nancy Pelosi has called the cover-up about that phone call. Mike Pompeo didn't blow the whistle on that phone call after listening to it, but today a senior State Department official blew the whistle on Mike Pompeo. The whistles are not going to stop in the Trump administration. Every Trump enabler should fear the sound of the next whistle. When President Nixon was forced to resign the presidency, when a Democratic Congress was still investigating his criminality, President Nixon wasn't the only one destroyed by that impeachment investigation. President Nixon's attorney general went to prison. President Nixon's White House chief of staff went to prison. 48 Nixon administration officials were found guilty of crimes. Tonight, Mike Pompeo needs a criminal defense lawyer. The Secretary of State needs his own privately paid for criminal defense lawyer to advise him on how to handle his response to the impeachment investigation. Mike Pompeo has no attorney-client privilege with State Department lawyers or Trump administration lawyers. The same goes for Attorney General William Barr. Like Richard Nixon's Attorney General, William Barr needs to hire his own personal, privately paid for criminal defense lawyer because William Barr does not have attorney-client privilege with anyone in the Trump administration. And now William Barr could be as deeply implicated in what Nancy Pelosi has called the Trump cover-up as Richard Nixon's Attorney General was in the Nixon cover-up. The New York Times broke the story today that William Barr convinced President Trump to call the Prime Minister of Australia to get Australia's help in the Trump re-election campaign by asking him to help William Barr undermine the Mueller investigation. The New York Times reports, in making the request, one of many at Mr. Barr's behest, Mr. Trump was in effect asking the Australian government to investigate itself. FBI counterintelligence investigators began examining any Trump ties to Russia's 2016 election interference after Australian officials told the Bureau that Russian intermediaries had made overtures to Trump advisors about releasing political damaging information about Hillary Clinton. Australia's top diplomat in Britain had met in London in May 2016 with George Papadopoulos, a Trump campaign foreign policy advisor, who revealed the Russian offer of dirt on Mrs. Clinton. The New York Times sources for this story are, quote, 2 American officials. So 2 American officials are blowing the whistle on William Barr and Donald Trump. The whistleblowers are everywhere now. The same Times story also reports that William Barr flew to Italy last week and met with Italian government officials on Friday. The Justice Department refuses to say whether the Attorney General discussed the Mueller investigation with Italian officials. No Attorney General of the United States has been implicated in an impeachment investigation since Richard Nixon's attorneys general, two of whom were actually convicted of crimes in that investigation. Tonight, the Attorney General of the United States once again needs his own personally paid for criminal defense lawyer who might soon become the only person William Barr can safely talk to in Washington. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.